It is both a professional and a personal pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Jon D. Levenson. Levenson is the Albert A. List Professor of Jewish Studies at Harvard Divinity School and affiliated faculty in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the same institution. Educated at Harvard, Levenson holds the BA in English from Harvard College and the MA and PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. Prolific and one of the most significant authors of our time in Hebrew Bible studies and the study of early Judaism, Levenson is the author of more than 11 monographs. Most recently, Inheriting Abraham, the Legacy of the Patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Princeton UP 2012. Abraham, Between Torah and Gospel, the Père Marquette Lecture in Theology from 2011. Resurrection, the Power of God for Christians and Jews, co-authored with his Harvard colleague, Kevin J. Madigan. And among others, two of my real favorites, Creation and the Persistence of Evil, the Jewish drama of divine omnipotence, and Sinai and Zion, an entry into the Jewish Bible. Many of you know, but maybe all don't, that Professor Levenson was on this faculty from 1982 to 1988. And during that period, he was one of my teachers and an immensely transformative influence on my own intellectual work. Starting with the hard part was he gave me a sight-reading passage from Job on my doctoral qualifying examination, and I think my heart rate has now returned to normal, but that was in 1986. But above all, I think working with Professor Levenson, I came to see the power and significance of reception history in relation to biblical texts, and in particular the ways in which that is not incompatible with, but is an integral part of genuinely historical and theological work. The title of his lecture this afternoon is Abraham and the Absoluteness of God. Please join me in welcoming Professor Levenson back to the University of Chicago.
Thank you very much, Dean Mitchell. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, what the Dean didn't mention is that I put that Job passage on so I could find out what it meant, and not just what the King James Bible says it means. And I also want to thank especially Mr. Levergood, Thomas Levergood, and my old friend, Father Paul Mankowski, for the kindness to me, and the whole Lumen Christi Institute for co-sponsoring this lecture. I think this is the first lecture I have given in this room since I tried out for the faculty here in March 1982. I went to other lectures in this room, but I think I've not stood here boring an audience since 1982. And walking around the campus and walking around the building today and taking advantage of the splendid hospitality that I've been shown here, brings back a lot of very, very happy memories of what really was intellectually the most exciting years of my life. My years here in the University of Chicago Divinity School were far and away intellectually the most exciting years of my life. In fact, when I left Chicago in 1980 for Harvard, after only a few weeks of teaching at Harvard, I realized that I'd had an effect on both institutions. My departing Chicago for Harvard raised the average IQ in both places. Now, I also want to say thank you to the Jewish Studies Workshop. I was actually present when it was originally formed. The person who first thought the idea up was Professor Sam Jaffe of the German department. And I remember one of our first real organizational meetings was in the medical school, because Irv Rosenberg from the medical school, who was from the gastroenterology department, was a major supporter of this. And we had it in the gastroenterology lab of the medical school. And I remember noticing the pictures around the wall, which is not the same as the pictures you see here. They were pictures of the lower intestinal tract and so forth. And I remarked in my understated way on the appropriateness of that to the subject. To which Irv Rosenberg told this story. He said, when I was first starting out, I was doing a colonoscopy on an old Jewish woman. And he said at a certain point in this process, she craned her head around and looked at me and said to me, "Does your mother know what you do for a living?" So that's a natural into text 1 on the handout. Text 1 is from Genesis 12. The first you really hear of anything that Abraham is doing is God speaking to Abraham. In text 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land, from your kin group, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." The last half verse, the number of possible translations. Some of you may know the more classical King James, "In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed," and so forth. However one deals with that verse, you see what the essence of Abraham is, I think, not only in this passage, but throughout Genesis and throughout the Hebrew Bible. Abraham is a father. He is going to be the father of the promised nation. He's going to be the father of the Goy Gadol, the great nation. Of course, he's got a problem. As we discover in the verses just before this, at the end of chapter 11, Abraham's problem is that his wife is barren. His wife is barren, maybe too old to have a child, and maybe barren all her life, or maybe both. And so this is going to be a problem. How is he going to be the father of a great nation if he's not the father of anybody? It reminds me of the time the Jew got on the bus and sat down next to the Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest, like Father Mankowski, was wearing the Roman collar. He hadn't kicked the habit. And the Jew turns to the Catholic priest and says, "Pardon me, sir, are you aware that you're wearing your shirt on backwards?" And the priest said, No, I'm a father. And the Jew says, "Well, I'm a father too. I don't wear my shirt on backwards." At which point the priest said, No, you don't understand. I'm a father to thousands. The Jew said, "In that case, leave your shirt the way it is and put your pants on backwards." So Abraham's, the major dynamic, to grossly oversimplify, that was a split infinitive, to oversimplify grossly, is that Abraham in Genesis is a man who's promised a nation, promised a land, promised his descendants will inherit a land, but he has no descendants. It seems impossible for the promise to come true, but miraculously it does come true. And then the question becomes, well, which of those sons is going to inherit him? How are we going to work this out? What if we lose the promised son? And all that dynamic in the second half of the Abraham story in the book of Genesis. What you don't see in Genesis, or in the Hebrew Bible generally, in association with Abraham, is the idea that Abraham has a distinctive teaching, that Abraham has a distinctive theology. Abraham is a father. He's not a founder. To compare him with other people who are thought of as founders of religion, whether accurately or not, with Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad, this is problematic. He is, through natural means blessed by supernatural intervention, he is a father of a promised nation, eventually the nation Israel, which is the name of his grandson, but also of other nations. He becomes father of a multitude of nations, Av Hamon Goyim. He does start some cult sites. He does found sanctuaries, but there's no sense of a distinctive teaching. And what you don't see him doing is polemicizing in any way against the religion of the people with whom he comes into contact. This has been pointed out many times by Yechezkel Kaufman and others many times over the years, that he really doesn't seem to be engaged in any sort of distinctive religion. He's not thought of as the founder of a religion, whatever the use of that term is, or accuracy of that term is for the ancient world. He's something different. Now, of course, in most of the Hebrew Bible, you do see a lot of polemic against the environing religions. You see polemics against Mesopotamian religion, you see polemics against Egyptian religion, you see polemics against Canaanite religion. This is the stuff of many of the prophets. Think of Elijah, think of Jeremiah, think of Hosea. That's very much the norm. It's an interesting question. Why is it in Genesis you don't have that? Why specifically with this revered figure Abraham do you not have these polemics? And there are many possible answers. It would take us too far afield to survey them, and nobody can really pronounce with authority on them. A very conservative position might be because this is an authentic reminiscence of some sort of pre-prophetic religion. in which that opposition of the God of Israel and Baal and other gods of the Canaanites had not yet developed. That's a possibility. Another possibility, a little less conservative than that, and not making such bold historical claims as that, might be to say something like this. The source that wrote this lived before there was that sharp opposition. Now, a problem with that is if you follow the classic documentary thinking, classical documentary hypothesis, the source we're talking about for Abraham is what? We're talking about J, a little e, and some p. The sigla indicate antecedent compositions that were woven together, redacted into the Pentateuch as we now have it. Please don't pronounce it Pentateuch. To go back to that subject. But those same sources are the same ones writing Exodus, and to some degree some of them Leviticus, and it's kind of hard to imagine, for example, the Pharaoh of the Exodus is certainly very much a worshiper of false gods and does not realize who the true God is. That's the whole point of the plague story in a certain reading of Exodus. If those are the same sources, why the sudden shift when you get to Exodus? Why the sudden shift into this attitude of opposition and hostility? More recently, Joseph Blenkinsop of Notre Dame University has come out with the theory that really the Abraham story and Genesis story, especially Abraham, is basically post-exilic. It's the Persian period when the Jews are a small minority living in an empire presided over by Persians. They're not in a good position to be going around criticizing and denouncing other people's religions. When you're a small, vulnerable minority, you're not struggling and dependent on the authorities. You're not in a good position to go around telling the authorities that their religion is a lot of garbage and you're worshiping rocks and stones and so forth. So that would be his theory, but there'd be many people who would say that chronologically Blenkinsop's theory is not has its own internal problems, especially if you try to square it in any way, as he does not with the documentary hypothesis. He has a book coming out within a few weeks, I think, on Abraham that argues that. All right. It's not true, though, to say that this notion of Abraham as a founder with a distinctive theology critical of that of the other gods is not found anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. There's a slight hint of this in text 2 on your handout. Then Joshua said to all the people, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel." This is Joshua, Moses' successor, speaking in his swan song at Shechem at the end of the book of Joshua. "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, in olden times your forefathers, Terach, the father of Abraham and father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates and led him through the whole land of Canaan and multiplied his offspring. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir as his possession, while Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt." Now what's interesting here is this is a kind of little précis of the Pentateuchal story, starting with Abraham, interestingly, and going through the Exodus and the conquest that's just now been completed. But what's interesting is what you see here at the end of verse 2. Terach, the father of Abraham and father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. Other gods, familiar language from the Decalogue and elsewhere, might lead you to believe that, in fact, there is some hint of a theological difference. In other words, God taking Abraham out of Mesopotamia was more than just a migration from an unpromised land to a promised land. Here in text 2, it is more than that. Here there's a theological difference, and the ancestors, you see in this verse alone, were idolaters. Okay. This develops, this little hint of 2 words, 3 words, they worshipped other gods at the end of that verse in Joshua 24, becomes enormously important for the history of Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, and Islam. One of the first examples of it is in the Book of Jubilees, which is text 3. The Book of Jubilees is a book that's not part of any continuing Jewish canon. It's written probably in the mid-2nd century BCE. It's sometimes described as sectarian, but that's a problem in Second Temple Judaism. What's the norm? What's the sect? What's the church, so to speak? What's the sect? It does have its own distinctive theology and its own distinctive, totally solar calendar, and attempts to reread history in terms of the solar calendar and so forth and so on, all of which is not terribly relevant. So I won't use the word sectarian, but I would tell you this, that Second Temple Judaism was different from modern Judaism in that in Second Temple times the Jews had a lot more sects than they do today. Now, in text 3, here you've got Abraham as a small boy. You have a reconstruction, an imaginative, whatever, reconstruction of the life of Abraham as a child. It says in text 3, the lad began understanding the straying of the land, that everyone went astray after graven images. See how that language of the Decalogue and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible comes up. And after pollution, and he separated from his father so that he might not worship the idols with him. And he began to pray to the Creator of all so that he might save him from the straying of the sons of men, and so that his portion might not fall into the straying after the pollution and scorn. He realized everybody is engaged in these defiling, polluting activities, which are the worship of false gods. And he, on his own, realized that. He also sees, elsewhere in Jubilees, he sees through astrology. He comes to believe in the providential, personal God. And he then remonstrates with his father. He says, why do you worship those who have no spirit in them? Because they're the work of the hands. You're carrying them upon your shoulders. There's no help from them for you, except great shame for those who made them, and the misleading of the heart for those who worship them. He says, do not worship them. And his father said, I also know that, my son, but what shall I do to the people who have made me minister before them? And if I speak to them in righteousness, they'll kill me because their souls cleave to them. Their souls cleave to those idols. They're the original bitter clingers. So that they might worship them and praise them. Be silent, my son, lest they kill you. And he told this matter to his two brothers, and they were angry with him, and he kept quiet. So poor Abraham is against not only his townsmen for their idolatry, he's against his father. His father knows better, but is afraid to stand up. And his father and brothers did not take kindly to this critique of the traditional religion, even though his father, in fact, sees that it's true. If you go to the next text, you see this developed even more in a very interesting way. In text 4, we have the Apocalypse of Abraham, a text that survives in Old Church Slavonic, but a Jewish text, most of which can plausibly be dated to the 1st century, the Common Era. And here's a very interesting thing. Here is Abraham seeing through his father's idolatry. His father makes idols, and Abraham has to take them and deliver them to the customers and so forth. And he's loads them on the cart, and one day he's going along, and the head of an idol falls off. The head of the icon, which is interpreted in all these texts as idolatry. We'll get to that later. Iconography is simply identified with idolatry. It falls off, and he tells his dad, hey, I don't know what to do. And his dad says, don't worry, we'll make a new one. And Abraham says, what, that's your God? That's your God? You're not bothered by the idea of the head falling off? Of course, an actual Babylonian would be very upset if the head fell off the icon and would not regard the icon as simply a material being, or the God as simply a material being, but that's a whole other subject. Another time, he's going across a bridge over the River Gur, as I recall, and the cart jostles, and one of the icons falls off into the river, and so Abraham expects it to come back up. The young Abraham says, well, bring yourself back up. But of course it doesn't happen. He realizes there's no power in these things. That's the reasoning. There's no power in these things. So in text 4, and it came to pass as I was thinking like these with regard to my father Terach in the court of my house, the voice of the Mighty One came down from the heavens in a stream of fire, saying and calling, Abraham, Abraham. And I said, here I am, obviously dependent on Genesis 22, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And he said, you're searching for the God of gods, the creator in the understanding of your heart. I am he. I am the God you've been searching for. The God you've been searching for using your own reason. I'm now going to reveal myself. I am he. Go forth from Terach your father and go out of the house, that you may not be slain in the sins of your father's house. And I went out, and as it came to pass as I went out, I was not yet outside the entrance of the court, that the sound of a great thunder came and burned him and his house and everything in the house down to the ground 40 cubits. So when God tells Abraham in Genesis 12, go forth mibeit avicha, from your father's house, Apocalypse of Abraham doesn't just understand that as a kin group, as the Beit Av, a small, something maybe a little bigger than a nuclear family. They understand it as a building. Apocalypse of Abraham understands the building. God will, in a kind of apocalyptic intervention, destroy that building for its idolatry. But you, since you have seen through the idols, you can clear out, and they're going to be destroyed, which explains why, on the reading of the Apocalypse of Abraham, Terach, his father, is dead before Abraham gets the call to leave, as we saw in text 12. Okay. Finally, this tradition of Abraham in opposition to the idolatry, and particularly to his idol-making father, this comes into Rabbinic Judaism richly, and it eventually comes into the Quran. It's very prominent in the Quran, I think Surah 21, if I remember, and becomes an important part of Islamic tradition about Ibrahim. But here is text 5. Here's a famous midrash. Here's how the rabbis, maybe 100, 200 years after the Apocalypse of Abraham, are receiving and shaping this piece of folklore. Abraham does the following. His father goes out, takes a break, and puts him in charge of the idol store. So the father leaves Abraham in charge, and Abraham does this. He takes a baseball bat. Now, I know you say there were no baseball bats then. Okay, so he takes a club, takes a golf club, and he smashes all the idols except the biggest one, and he puts the club in the hand of the biggest one, okay? So his father comes back from Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, and, donut in one hand and coffee in the other, whatever, and he says, text 5, when his father came back, he said, "What have you done to them?" He, namely Abraham, replied, "Why should I hide it from you? A woman came with a plate of fine flour and asked me to offer it to them." One of those idols said, "I'm eating it first." Another one said, "I'm eating it first." Sounds like my family. The biggest one then took the club and smashed them. He said, the father said, "Why are you deceiving me? Do they know anything?" He, namely Abraham, answered, "Do your ears not hear what's coming out of your mouth? You just admitted they don't know anything, but you're trying to sell them as gods?" You see how this works? And this comes very close to this into the Quran. Now, what we see here in all of these cases, in Jubilees, Apocalypse of Abraham, and this rabbinic midrash from Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, is a notion of two things, solving, I think, two theological problems. One problem is that why does God choose Abraham? Why does God reveal himself to Abraham? The election of Abraham. Why not to his brother Haran? Why not to his brother Nahor? Why to Abraham? Apart from the larger question, why to anybody, what's so special about Abraham? Abraham hasn't done a thing when he's chosen in Genesis, plain reading of Genesis, he hasn't done anything to deserve election. By the time his life is over, he's done a number of things, including proven willing to sacrifice his promised son, Isaac. But at the beginning of Genesis, he hasn't done anything. Now, if you like that, you call that grace, the unmerited benefaction. A person receives what they don't deserve, something positive they don't deserve, and you could call that grace. If you don't like it, you could call it arbitrariness. There's no real standards. Justice doesn't amount to anything. This guy gets it. I don't. Why? Second Temple Judaism, and especially Rabbinic Judaism, does not like the notion of sheer grace. It's worried about grace that looks like arbitrariness, and it wants to show that Abraham was different. Abraham was different. I think that's true also in the book of Genesis in terms of the second angelic address after the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22, 15 through 18. In Genesis 22, 15 through 18, all those promises we saw in chapter 12 are now based on Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his beloved son. Lo chasachta bincha, you did not withhold your son. They weren't just sheer grace. They may have been grace when they came, but now Abraham has come to deserve them. That's why God is giving those same promises to Abraham in Genesis 22. I always tell my classes, the Abraham story begins in a Lutheran mode and ends in a Catholic mode. It begins in sheer, pure grace. It ends in grace and works working conjointly. Of course, you laugh because you get the illusion they have no idea what I'm talking about. So that solves that problem. It also demonstrates, I think, connected to that, the notion of God, a God who is, discoverable by reason. To say you only know God to the extent to which he reveals himself in special revelation, well, it leaves a lot of humanity out, and it also seems a little arbitrary. But say that Abraham was able to reason, he was able to see through astrology. He was able to see through the material limitedness of the icons and realize they weren't divine. That was a great boon, I think, to Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism. It just wasn't some purely random act of revelation. There was some reasonable defense of the belief in the transcendent Creator God. Now, of course, in ancient Israel, the tradition, at least mandated in the Hebrew Bible, was a tradition that's aniconic. It doesn't have icons. It forbids icons. It doesn't just forbid them in worship, it really forbids them in general, although they were somehow allowed and found in the carvings and so forth, were found in the temple itself. But famously in the Decalogue, they're simply forbidden. And all these polemics that we've been reading, including later ones, later rabbinic literature and in the Quran and so forth, they all identify, as I mentioned, the icon with an idol. The use of iconography in worship they see as ipso facto idolatrous. Now, any ancient Mesopotamian, I think, would have objected to this characterization of his religion. I remember when I studied Mesopotamian religion with Torkild Jakobsen, his analogy, which he also gives in his book Towards the Image of Tammuz, is it's really a theophany. The icon is produced under certain sacral conditions, certain sacred conditions, certain religious norms, and has to be inaugurated as a manifestation of the deity according to an elaborate ritual. In some forms of the ritual, the icon maker actually says, I didn't make this. And it's a theophany, it's an apparition of the deity. The deity becomes manifest, or maybe for the Lumen Christi Institute, I should say incarnate in that icon. The prophets of Israel and ancient Jews and Muslims did not seem to have picked up that difference or that nuance. And so I think in some sense you could say all these texts are unfair to those whose worship includes iconography. Though you find this sort of notion that the icon is an idol, you still find it among some Jews and some Muslims and some Calvinistic and other Protestants to this day. But I do think in the rejection of iconography there is something very important that tells you a great deal about ancient Judaism and modern Judaism and certainly the religion of ancient Israel, namely the Jewish preference for the ear over the eye. This is especially prominent in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy actually says, in rehearsing the event at Sinai and the revelation of the Decalogue, or Ten Commandments, I don't like to say Ten Commandments for various reasons. It's not really a Jewish term, and also it's the name of a movie. If there were a movie called Decalogue, I probably wouldn't call it that either. But I haven't seen these new biblical movies. I haven't seen the Noah movie. Years ago, students asked me whether I had seen Prince of Egypt. I said, no, I'm waiting for the book to come out. But Deuteronomy, in retelling that Sinaitic experience, says, Lo iten kol tumunah. You didn't see anything, using that word tumunah. You didn't see any image. You had no vision at all. There was nothing visionary at all at Sinai. Quite different from what you would think to look at Exodus. But Deuteronomy, the key thing is shmiata ozen, hearing, meaning obeying. And if you think about it for a minute, this notion of the ear as preferable to the eye is, I think, connected to or fits nicely with a religion based on a story, on a narrative, a recitation of the Bagnalia Dei, the great acts of God, the redemption history, or Heilsgeschichte, as a key aspect of communal religious life. Stories unfold over time. They appeal to the ear, not the eye. The eye catches one moment. The story sound becomes meaningful only as through duration. Stories cannot be perceived synoptically or just plain optically, but they can be understood with the ear. And I think the religion of Israel strongly emphasized what you might call this theology and this ritual practice of recitation. And the notion of straying after, or to use one of the idioms, whoring after the eyes, and all these texts come from hoary antiquity, whoring after the eyes that was seen as a threat. and whatever the origins of the aniconic tradition of the Hebrew Bible was, which is a subject I'm totally avoiding. So the notion here is that reason and empirical demonstration alike can prove not necessarily the existence of God, but they can show the non-divinity of material things. Material things lack, according to this polemic, perception, mind, will, and the capacity to act. They're limited by their materiality and cannot be divine. They all have a limited quality. They're finite, and to imagine them as the creator of everything else is unrealistic in this particular theology. Now, in the Greek world, there was developing towards the end of the First Temple into the exile period of Israel, 6th century BCE, also a polemic against the gods. The gods of Homeric myth, the traditional Greek gods, running around naked, chasing each other, castrating each other, and doing various things like that, seemed unworthy of a theos, of a deity. That's God, and a philosophical critique of the gods appears also in Greece around about the 6th century BCE. I don't say that early this is affecting Jewish sources, but eventually I think there's a kind of interesting symbiosis of those Greek and Jewish critiques. And here's an example of one from Greece. This is from Xenophanes of Colophon, pre-Socratic. Text 6. But mortals suppose the gods are born, wear their own clothes, and have a voice and a body. That's what people imagine. The gods are born, wear clothes, have a body, a voice. But if horses or oxen or lions had hands, or could draw with their hands and accomplish such works as men, horses would draw the figurines of gods as similar to horses, and of the sort which each of them had. I read this in a class of mine. A student had a brilliant idea. I said, who was the great horse theologian? And this fellow, without missing a beat, said Thomas Aquinas. That was good. I thought that was really good. So I think next time I tell it, I'll just leave his name out of it. Not the Thomas Aquinas, but the student. Ethiopians say their god are snub-nosed and black. Thracians say theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. Everybody imagines the god looks like them. And all you do is do a little comparative ethnography, and you discover each group imagines the god has the same sort of body, same sort of racial characteristics or whatever that they have. And this is a serious problem. Now, you might think that what these fragments of Xenophanes indicate is a kind of anticipation of modern notions of projectionism. That what religion really is a projection of human needs, human values, only in a very visual sense. And they imagine the gods are just human beings writ large. So the gods are the projections of the believers as a kind of secularizing move, very much like Feuerbach in 19th century European thought. Actually, it seems to have been the reverse. At least reading about Xenophanes, he doesn't seem to have been an atheist. He wrote these satirical lines in defense of the greatness and transcendence of God. Greater and more transcendent than all those people with their anthropomorphisms, their creating God in the image of man, could imagine. Here is what Windelband said in his turn to the 20th century history of philosophy about Xenophanes. He says his maintenance of monotheism, which he expressed as enthusiastic intuition in the saying that whithersoever he looked, all was constantly flowing together for him into nature, mianes fusit, into one nature, took on at once, however, that sharp polemic turn against the popular faith by which he is principally characterized in the literature. The scorn which he poured out with abundant wit over the anthropomorphism of mythology, the anger with which he pursued the poets as the portrayers of these divine figures, provided with all the weaknesses and vices of human nature, these rest upon an ideal of God which will have the supreme being regarded as incomparable with man in both bodily and mental characteristics. So if that's true, if he meant to affirm the transcendence and supremacy of God, Xenophanes was more a precursor to someone like Spinoza than a precursor to someone like Feuerbach. But you might say, well, if this is becoming a position among a certain intellectual elite, where do the Jews stand? Because the Jewish God, if all you do is open up the Hebrew Bible, and you can see that the Jewish God is described as having hands, a nose. When he gets angry, it's vayachar apo, his nose heated up, his nostrils heated up. And you know, if you think of getting angry as your nostrils heating up, then the longer your nose, this is not just self-interest that makes me say this, the longer your nose, the more long-suffering and more patient you are. So erech apayim, long of nostrils, that indicates he doesn't get angry easily. So this seems very, what should I call it, anthropomorphic. God has a hand, he has a tongue, he has lips, he carries a sword in some places. And so you might say, well, this critique of the traditional Greek gods, if the Jews enter that Greco-Roman world, they're going to be just the butt of a lot of humor because of their primitive God. And that was certainly a challenge. But I think there are certain resources that the Jews had. One resource is one I already mentioned, the Aniconic tradition. Hey, you Greeks, you're the ones putting up idols. You're the ones imagining your gods. You're the ones that have gods with, all the human body parts. We say you can't make an image of our God. Our God is unimaginable, cannot be imaged. You're the ones with that. If you look at the Abraham story, oddly enough, in the Abraham story, you don't hear about God's hands, lips, eyes, mouth. You hear him saying things, but Abraham doesn't really have a vision of the deity in that sense. Maybe he sees a smoking torch as a symbol of the deity at one point in Genesis 15, but you really don't see a highly anthropomorphic deity there. When he founds those cult sites that I mentioned earlier, he doesn't set up an idol there. He doesn't set up an icon there. He doesn't have any process of inaugurating the icon when he inaugurates the cult site. So if you think about this for a minute, the Aniconic tradition, and especially the august role of Abraham, and the absence of such anthropomorphic language in Genesis, you can imagine the Jews saying, look, we're the ones whose fathers saw through all of the anthropomorphisms. Long before you ever came along, we were already seeing through the anthropomorphisms, and we were forbidding anybody to imagine that they could make a picture, an image, any visual description of this deity. And Abraham was the one who, on his own unaided reason, was able to figure that out, and that's why we've been chosen. That's why Abraham's been chosen. That's why you have the election of Abraham. The God towards whom he reasoned revealed himself personally to Abraham and saved his life from idolatry. And so you could see how Jewish philosophers who were inheritors of both those traditions, the scriptural tradition, but also that Greek tradition, could see in Abraham a very precious resource. And the good example of that here is text 7. This is Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher living in Hellenistic Egypt from, 20 BCE or something to 40 CE. I sometimes wonder why maybe some of his works were lost or survive in strange languages because he had them on disk during the Y0K problem. But here he's talking about the migrations of Abraham. All right, Abraham with his father goes from Ur to Haran. And then he, without his father, goes from Haran into the land of Canaan. Big deal. Who cares about this geography? Who cares? But from Philo's point of view, all right, at the literal level it might mean one thing, but let's try to read it allegorically. Let's try to read it in a philosophically enlightened way. Here's what he says, text 7. The migrations as set forth by the literal text of the scriptures are made by a man of wisdom, but according to the laws of allegory, by a virtue-loving soul in its search for the true God. This isn't just a change of place. This is a change of theology. This is a search for God. This is a journey to discover the true God. For the Chaldeans, the people he left in Mesopotamia, were especially active in the elaboration of astrology, which in those days was indistinguishable from astronomy. Well, I think only in modernity is there can we make a hard distinction: astronomy and astrology. And the Chaldeans ascribed everything to the movements of the stars. They suppose that the course of the phenomena of the world is guided by influences contained in numbers and numerical proportions. I don't know if that's anti-Pythagorean or what that is, but they overrated math. They thought the whole world could be understood according to mathematics. Thus, they glorified visible existence, namely the planets, the heavenly bodies, leaving out of consideration the intelligible and the invisible, that which can be known only through the intellect, the disembodied intellect. They concluded that the world itself was God. They identified God with nature, with the world itself. They couldn't see a transcendent creator, thus profanely likening the created to the creator, a classic definition of idolatry, mistaking the created for the creator, to the creator, pepoi koti. In this creed, Abraham had been reared. Abraham was actually reared as a Chaldean in Ur-Kasdim, in the land of the Chaldeans. He'd been raised in astrology. And for a long time, he remained a Chaldean. He remained someone who believed in astrology, in that he thought that astrology controlled human destiny. The movements of the stars and the mathematical proportions, what we might call the laws of astrophysics, controlled human destiny. Then, opening the soul's eye, as though after a profound sleep, and beginning to see the pure beam instead of the deep darkness, he followed the ray and discerned what he had not beheld before, a charioteer and a pilot presiding over the world. By some form of mystical illumination, Abraham is moved out from the world of astrology, from the world of materialism, from determinism, from a belief that mathematical proportions and mathematical formulae control human existence, to an awareness of a providential God, the charioteer and a pilot, to use his heavily Greek image. And this comes over, by the way, also into rabbinic Judaism. When it says in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham, renews the whole promise, and Abraham said, what good does it do? I don't have any children, right? And God says, God took him, Abraham, outside, and he said to him, Habet Hashemayim, look at the sky, count the stars, if you can count them. Count those stars. In the Talmud, the text says, he's not just saying your progeny could be more numerous than the stars, though in the plain sense that's what he's saying. He's saying he took him out of astrology. He took him outside of the world of astrology. He said, those stars aren't going to control what happens. It's a very interesting evolution. It occurs also in the Quran, where Ibrahim at a certain point sees through astrology. First worships the sun, the moon, and the stars, but comes to see through them. When each one of them sets, he says, this can't be God, it's set. Right? Sun looked great. Guess what? It was nighttime. That's not God. Okay. So this notion of the immaterial God, this comes to be associated in ancient and all subsequent Judaism with the figure of Abraham. And it fits in with a certain theme of continuing Jewish theology, which stresses precisely that aniconic tradition and the mistake, even the idolatry of imagining God with a physical form. Now, the best example of this, of course, is Maimonides, text 8. And if I had to characterize Maimonides' philosophy in one word, I would say he was Maimonidean. He had a very strong, you wonder why that's maybe why he went into that school of thought. But he regarded the identification of God with any physical characteristics as the rankest idolatry. Now, what do you do when you read the Hebrew Bible and people claim to see God? Visually, they see God. They hear God, God's mouth, tongue, ears, nose, etc. What do you do with that? Well, you read it in a philosophically sophisticated way, said Maimonides in the 12th century. So this is from his Guide of the Perplexed, written in Egypt in Arabic. He says, our whole purpose was to show that whenever the words seeing, vision, and looking occur in the Bible in this sense, intellectual apprehension is meant, and not the eye's sight, as God, may he be exalted, is not an existence, not one being among many, that can be apprehended with the eyes. If, however, an individual of insufficient capacity should not wish to reach the rank to which we desire him to ascend. Person, pretty low intellectual level and just happy to stay there. We desire, and should he consider that all the words figuring in the Bible concerning this subject are indicative of sensual perception of created lights, be they angels or something else, why, there's no harm in thinking this. All that language of seeing is nothing but intellectual apprehension. A low-level person incapable of philosophical sophistication and philosophical enlightenment, when he could say, well, when they see God, what they see is a created light, not the body of God, not a luminescent deity, but a created light, whether it be heavenly bodies or angels or whatever, that's okay for the low-level people, as long as they don't say that they actually saw God. They just see something that God created. And that Maimonidean tradition is alive and well, and many people think to this day they simply identify it, to mix a metaphor, whole hog with Judaism. But the question is it really the only vector, so to speak, in continuing Jewish tradition? And that's where we get to a kind of counter-tradition I want to allude to briefly here. Text 9 is from something called Shir HaKavod. Shir HaKavod is a song ascribed to Yehuda HaChassid, Yehuda of Regensburg, who died around 1217, or to his father Shmuel. So, early 13th century, late 12th century hymn. It's most often sung today in synagogues by a kid who's maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years old at the end of the Sabbath service, when people have been sitting there for 2.5 hours, usually by that point more bored than you are now, and finding themselves hungry, and this little kid in his falsetto gets up there and sings this in this idiotic sing-song tune. And then the congregation, who are adults, say, no, 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 right? And so you could think that this is the height of stupidity. That's the adults that are not already breaking for the food or rehearsing the sports scores or whatever they're talking about. So, but the truth is, if you read this poem carefully, it seems to want to say, yes, God is incorporeal, immaterial, insensible in that sense, but through his grace and through his accommodation, has made himself available in a multitude of images on earth. Those images are not just people's confusions. Those images are not just the product of the fevered imagination of the prophets. Those images are actually ways in which one could, in the moment, perceive God. But there's no one image that defines God, and the very shape-shifting, the very fact God can appear as old or young or this, that, and the other, already shows that you can't say he has a body like any other body, because we don't control our bodies and make them young or old at will, or invisible at will, the way God does. So I just gave a little snippet here in text 9 from Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's prayer book, where he tries to capture the rhyme. Recounting your grandeur and your glory of your deeds, they told the story. They depicted you, though not as you are, but as you do, your acts, your power. They represented you in many visions. Through them all, you are one without divisions. So the point would be that God has supplied visions of himself to the prophets, but the God who does that transcends the visions. But the visions are real. The visions are not visions of something else. The visions are not the result of the prophets just having a low intellectual capacity. It's something that God has provided. Him shilucha barov chezionot hincha echad b'chol dimirot. They represent you in many visions. Through them all, you are one without divisions. He says, hincha echad. You're one. You have a oneness that no object could ever have. And I happened about a year ago to be reading in the Syriac poems of Ephraim, 4th century Eastern Christian figure, trying desperately to get my Syriac back into shape after many years, in which I think the term you use in canon laws fell into desuetude. And I came upon this, I thought it was quite remarkable. This is really very much the same view as you have in text 9 in this medieval hymn. This is by a Christian writer in the 4th century, I guess you'd say Mesopotamia. He says, "In his love, he made for himself a countenance, so that his servants might behold him. But lest we be harmed by imagining he really was like this, he moved from one likeness to another to teach us that he has no likeness. Men demu lathmu shani den alfan de le lightle demutha." He moved from one likeness to another to teach us he doesn't have a likeness. He appears in likenesses, but he's not limited to any one likeness. That strikes me as a different way of accounting for the biblical evidence. That Abraham would see through the icons and the idols and realize they don't actually exhaust the deity. On the other hand, this doesn't necessarily imply that the deity cannot appear in anthropomorphic or other forms, theriomorphic, animal form, whatever. And in the around 1928, the Jewish theologian Franz Rosenzweig wrote a little essay on anthropomorphism. I think it was in response to the appearance of the German Jewish Encyclopedia. And critical of this notion, Judaism rejects all anthropomorphism. Here is what Rosenzweig says, I think making the point that I just tried to make by opposing Maimonides and the Shira Kavod and Ephraim the Syrian. And this is text 11. The assumption that biblical anthropomorphisms make is none other than the double one that the Bible commonly makes, namely that God is capable of what he wills and that the creature is capable of what he should be. Biblical anthropomorphisms are the single protection against the backsliding into polytheism, which indeed is nothing but a consolidation of a genuine present revelation of the real God to a lasting image of God precisely by this means, resisting the ever-new will of God's revelation. Now, when I ran across that English translation, I said, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I looked up the German, and well, that's what he says in the German. You might rephrase it. But the essence of the idea is that biblical anthropomorphisms, by their variety, by that very element I called shape-shifting, prove the independence and sovereignty of God over any one image. The idolater wishes to tether God to the one image, whatever it is, that one image, that is God. Whereas the biblical notion is something much more transient, that God appears and disappears, makes his voice heard and makes his voice not heard. It's not a voice like a human voice that can be readily heard. It's not a sight like a human sight that's always there, or a human body that can always be seen or felt or touched or whatever. Rather, this is a different God who makes himself known in a particular moment, but then transcends the needs of that moment and is always independent from it. Okay, larger conclusion. Abraham is someone who rediscovers, in the world of Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism, he rediscovers God. He rediscovers the oneness of God. He rediscovers the supremacy of God. He rediscovers the notion of creation. Over the centuries, creation is usually, especially in modern times, is usually understood as being the question, where did the world come from? What produced the world? Why is the world here? I'm not saying that's a bad question. It's how did the world with all its physical laws begin? Not a bad question. I don't know the answer to it. But phrased that way, it's a question of time. In other words, what was there before the world came to be? Now, I don't know much physics, partly because I was never good at math. I know why I wasn't good at math. There are 3 reasons: poor teaching and lack of innate talent. But I do know that people who I once was at a conference on religion and science, and I was sitting at the table with a bunch of scientists, and they mentioned the Big Bang theory. So I, being a naive humanist who doesn't know anything, I asked them. I said, "Let me ask you a question. I don't know anything about this stuff, but what was there before the Big Bang? In other words, 10 minutes before, what was going on 10 minutes before the Big Bang?" To which, I'm just repeating what this guy said. You may tell me it's wrong. I don't know. I'm just saying what he said. He said, "No, you don't understand. the Big Bang began as a dimensionless point. There was no space, there was no time. So to ask what went on before it doesn't make any sense. I said, well, thank you very much. That clears up that. That's how most people think of creation. I'm not saying it's a bad question. But I think there's a deeper, enduring philosophical question about the nature of the universe. Is the existence of the universe necessary or contingent? Does the world have to exist, or does it depend on something else? Does it depend on a cause? If it's contingent, then you can ask, what's the cause of it? If you want to show that the universe is self-caused, well, show it's self-caused and say it exists by necessity. There never was a possibility of the universe not existing. We can all agree the universe exists. The question is it theoretically possible it could not have existed? We all agree World War I took place. I would say it's theoretically possible World War I would not have taken place. So I would say it was a contingent event. It seems to me these texts are trying to say that the world and the things in it, the palpable material things, including the planets, including those bodies that ancients in the Greco-Roman world and Babylonian and much of the world thought of as controlling human destiny, not all of them, but many of them thought of as controlling human destiny. These texts want to say, no, they actually are themselves contingent phenomena. They are creations, they're not the creator. And in the classical Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition, the notion was that the existence of God is necessary. The existence of the world is contingent on God. To fail to see this is to step onto the path that leads to idolatry. That's how they can put astrology and iconography and creation together in the imagined life of Abraham. The profound current that you find in Jewish tradition, which is also picked up richly by Islam, specifically associates that as insight with none other than our father Abraham. Thank you.